I am here today because I have a dream, and you may call me a dream. It's okay. And as Dr. said, I'm not the only one. And I know that you're going to join us. You are joining us. You wouldn't be in this place at this time if you were not part of it. That's wonderful. That is so cool. Wow. So that song exists because someone had a dream. This building exists because someone had a dream. They had a vision. They had an idea of something that was possible. This microphone, everything we are wearing, everything that we see that isn't something that is an automatic development through the natural processes of everything else is here because someone dreamed it here. And they dreamed it in a way that it felt so real to them that it became part of our experience. And that just kind of blows me away. That when something feels real in the mind of an individual, it becomes real to everyone that can possibly resonate with that. I think we just need to let it go. It's just not. Thank you. Thank you for trying so much.
Okay.
So for whatever reason, we wrote this month together. Putting together this talk has been great fun because I have to think about that idea of dream. You know, as human beings, we think we dream when we go to sleep.
So,
and it's often very weird because in that dream process, the brain is saying, "Oh, I'll take a little bit of that," and lost. Some people call it the soul. That is the mind of who we are.
can we log back in?
Meeting.
Can I make it?
And when you do the word that's in my note, clear that my mind is part of a larger mind. Some folks say they have it right. My mind is part of the one mind. And that one mind, the physicists are calling
Would be this one.
And some physicists are saying that thing in the and that thing we call the quantum field are one and the same because information cannot be created or destroyed. It's just a new pattern.
This won't go down any further. Just be careful.
So my mind is part of one mind. And as I was sharing with the group yesterday, the 5 principles class, which is a wonderful, fabulous people, thank you for sharing that. As I was sharing with them, that idea that information cannot be created or destroyed means that all of our experiences always exist. Always exist. And we can access them, even our dreams. And one of the teachers of Charles and Berger, the founders of Unity, was Grace Hopkins, and she said, if you have been believing it, you will experience it even in your dreams. Sometimes that's the only place you will allow yourself to experience it, because you built such a wall against having your dreams come true that you're only allowed to have them in your imagination and in that sleep process where you bury it together. When I was growing up, my mother was a collector and avid reader of science fiction. We had a hall, a 40-foot long hall. I think that's probably money I was 3. And she had put in shelves, floor-to-ceiling shelves, along this whole hall. And over at one end, about this wide, were all the other kinds of books. And the rest of it was science fiction. She had all of the journals, all of the magazines, you know, about pulp fiction stuff going back. And she would tuck the duplicates behind because people would never return the books they had borrowed. So science fiction is a way of dreaming. And the people that my mother liked to read were generally people who'd been edited by a guy named John Campbell. And his assertion, insistence for all of his authors was it had to be coherent and consistent with scientific fact. Which meant all of these imaginings these guys were doing in all of these stories, and after a while there were a few women in there too. And all of those had to be scientifically acceptable, even though they were placed off the planet, often in things that were traveling at light speed, right? And with beings from all over the universe. So it was fascinating to grow up in this, and I avoided it as much as possible. Mostly because the beings on those covers were not really pretty. But she hooked me with a short story called Lord Powerful of Otherland. And it's the state police guy is knocked unconscious and he comes to in the same location, but in a different universe, a different time model of people. But he still has his gun, and he still has his uniform, and this entirely different way of being. And so I got hooked. The idea of being able to conceive, first of all, of a world that is totally different in the same location. Wow. And how to think about people encountering someone who was dressed like a state trooper when they'd never seen anything like that was very cool too. I got them. And then she would start feeding me, and finally, the number one author of science fiction besides Isaac Asimov, who we've heard about, is Robert Heinlein, and I began to think of him as my stepdad. And what these folks are doing is saying there could be a way of living that is so radically different and yet still human that we almost can't quite conceive of it. But let me take you on this journey and see if we can. I'm going to invite all of us to do the same thing. I think we all know that what started in the 60s, that we're celebrating today, the Stonewall incident happened June 28, 1969. And that was the beginning of people of, well, there were all kinds of different names for that, but we'll call it the LGBTQ community coming into public. Up to that point, the only way they could function was hidden. And they said no more that day. And that in 1969, there were 15 pro-gay rights groups. In 1970, there were 20,000 groups. Wow. Yeah. Huge. The world woke up. And that was really, in many ways, an extension of the whole civil rights movement that had been going on at that point for 7 or 8 years, right? People were saying, no more hiding who we really are. No more pretending that the world works that way when it really works this way. Not just one little piece of it, but all of it, yes? Well, as my life unfolded, I was in college and my mother said, I'm working for this guy, his name is Willis Harmon, and he's thinking we could integrate science fiction into the education programs. And I said, oh, boy, yes, we can. We can this and this and this and this. So she and I wrote a proposal while I was in college. And she was at Stanford Research Institute. And we put this proposal together, and Willis and I created the Center for the Study of Social Policy that included using fictional ideas to help people wake up to possible futures. And that's great. And as life went on, I ended up working for Willis Harmon at Stanford Research Institute, opposite Los Alamos. And yeah, we started doing this wonderful process of looking out 50 years down the road. What's the plan going to look like, right? Well, one of the tools that we found was this marvelous tool where this guy had traced literature, when an idea comes into the culture, it starts out in informal stuff. And then people start writing letters about it. And then they start exchanging, essays they've written or whatever. Now it's on the internet, it's on sites like medium.com, right? And then some of those get published in really weird little journals, And those really weird little journals, some journalist picks up on it and turns it into a news item, right? And that news item gets published as an opinion paper in the back of something. And then it just grows and grows until finally gets in the mainstream media and everyone is doing it. And I followed meditation this way. Between this, in the 70s, we never nobody did it. You had to be from India or go to India to learn how, right? But these couple of guys in Massachusetts, started offering techniques. They did a meditation. And people went, ooh, that's useful. I don't have any much pain. I'm not as tense as I used to be. So they had a dream that people could begin to experience this. And some people took up transcendental meditation, but most people did it through the back door. So that was the 70s. And by the 80s, people were starting to do something more with it. It was starting to get woven into your, you would be doing a workout at the gym and someone would say, now let's just take a little while and relax and go into that quiet place, right? And meditation and yoga began to overlap a little bit. And by the 90s, it was in the women's magazines. And then at 90s, it was part of the culture. Right? So that's one example of how this works. Someone had an idea, a dream of the possibility that people could go into the silence, turn off our normal stuff. Now, Charles Fillmore had been teaching that since 1888, but we won't tell people about that. So we're going to experience this process that unfolds. Well, the guy who developed this thing about it being in the literature is a man named Molitor. And as you look at this diagram, this process, it takes about 75 years from the point at which it's being talked about in those funny little papers to the point where everyone goes, well, that's normal, and they're not talking about it anymore. 75 years. Interesting. Well, back about 75 years, well, it's not 75 yet, it's only 60. About 60 years ago, people were talking about, let's acknowledge that we live a lot of different ways, and we're all different colors and lifestyles and genders and creeds, just like our statement. Oh my goodness, 60 years ago. And about 60 years ago, a bunch of guys started, singing these weird songs. We call them the Beatles. About love, about caring for each other, not necessarily being in love with someone. That was really big. And about the same time, this book that had come out in the 50s made mainstream literature, if you will. Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring. Isn't that interesting? About 60 years ago. And it takes about 75 years for things to become normal. What does that tell us about 15 years from now? That dream that was all those little bits and pieces that we all accepted, I know that because you're sitting here now. And if you have gray hair, you work like that. We accepted it. It's us. It's our dream. A world in which all of those ideas are normal. Not just weirdo things we do because we care. Not just because someone told us that it could be, that maybe someday, as Martin Luther King said, someday my children will be accepted for who they are, not what they live. So I worked as a futurist for over 20 years. And toward the end of that time, I began to be aware of this tradition here. And I studied for the ministry in this tradition. But I continued to teach, and I continued to write. And I wrote a little guidebook that was for my students who were trying to make that kind of world maybe. And I called the book A New American Dream. What would happen if we had a dream that looked like that? And a lot of my students used it for various consulting things. And someone took my last copy in 2002. It was the late 90s when I was handing it out as a student, actually the whole of the 90s to my students. And then about 2007, someone said, I'm not using this anymore. Do you want it back? And I finally have it. I've written it on a word processor that no longer exists, so I couldn't just pull it up. We didn't have the internet, and that had been published. It was, this unpublished guide, right? And I had it. So I immediately took it to some office place and said, scan this. So I could at least try to have an electronic version of this thing. And they did. And of course, if anyone has worked with scanned literature, you end up having to correct almost every line anyway. You might as well just have typed it. But I did. And I was able to turn that into a book. And that book came out in a couple of editions. And the last one before this month, the last one was called Home. We can create humanity's future. Creating humanity's future. And it's about land use and economic systems, and it's about how you set up academies that people can learn this stuff and live this stuff, and it's about social structures that work, and it's the how-tos. It's my guidebook. Well, a couple of weeks ago, someone wrote published a book that's a climate scientist, and she said, oh my gosh, I just figured out we're not all going to die. We could live on the planet. Yes, we can. So I've republished that book. There's a new edition. It's called Home. Well, Earth Can Still Be Home. A guide to creating a sustainable future. Earth can still be home. And the reason I know this is because of groups like this all over the world, lifting the consciousness out of the past how-tos and shoulds into a new way of living. You are going into the science. You are loving each other in spite of. You are being inclusive. And that is transforming the planet. Not just the people on the planet, but the planet itself. Because, as I said, whenever any individual dreams something, a microphone, a cell phone, a car, a chair, a dress, other people get to experience too. So, have you noticed that it's not 100 degrees today? Yeah. People are starting to see that we can have a climate that works when we live in that mindset that our affirmation today called for, and that is our climate of peace. The heat that we call climate change is in part the heat of the anger humanity has been in. As we dissolve the anger, the heat doesn't have to show up in our world. I'm not saying that any one person can transform the Earth's climate, okay? And I'm not saying this is the second coming. In Unity, we talk about the Christ mind, and we're really talking about the state of being that is one with the all that is. And when we're in that place, then what we dream must come to pass. It can't not. It can't not. So when I wrote that guide for my students, I also wrote a little thing to put at the back that kind of summarizes it. And I'd like to share that with you. Are you okay with that? Yes. I see a world, a life, where every human being knows he or she or they are loved and supported, physically, emotionally, and spiritually. And where each one of us experiences only a joyful deepening of our capacity to love, understand, and behold. I see a world in which every individual is acknowledged for the unique contribution that person brings to the lives of those around. I see peace. I see harmony. I see hope and appreciation in the faces of every young person, and gratitude and satisfaction in the faces of the elderly. I see trees growing to vast sizes, and whales and salmon swimming by the thousands. I see honeybees and butterflies flying through orchards and meadows filled with blossoms and fruit. I see meadowlarks and nightingales lifting their heads in song. I see deserts becoming prairies and parking lots becoming gardens. Yes, I see storm sewers becoming streams and rivers running clean and free. I see generations of gardeners rebuilding the soil and harvesting its fruits to share with their neighbors. I see neighbors coming together to build and repair homes, schools, libraries, and shops that make their lives meaningful and enjoyable. I see villages forming in which children roam freely, knowing that every adult cares for them. I see elders sitting in the sunshine or by the fire, telling stories of the past and setting standards for the future. I see a world, a life, where all humanity knows itself to be the experience and expression of the transcendent mystery of the all-living. All. Knowing this, where each one of us chooses to act, to speak, to think as the world created beings that we are. This is my vision. This is the vision I hold for my grandchildren and my grandchildren's grandchildren, for all the generations of humanity to come. And today, I call on you, each and every one of you, to join me in realizing this vision for ourselves and for all those future generations of humanity.